In just 67 seconds, $47 million in hidden FBI funding. Senator Chris Van Hollen didn't ask permission. He didn't warn anyone. Cameras captured everything. The room went silent. What did Van Hollen reveal about those Epstein files that made the FBI director completely lose control on live television? Picture this moment: the most powerful law enforcement agency in America about to be exposed by a manila folder. But there was something nobody knew about Van Hollen's preparation for this day. Something that started 3 months earlier in a parking garage in Baltimore, when a whistleblower handed him documents that would shake the very foundations of federal power. At exactly 2:47 p.m. on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the Senate Judiciary Committee chamber buzzed with nervous energy. FBI Director Christopher Wray sat rigid in his chair, his jaw already clenched before the first question. Beside him, newly confirmed FBI Director nominee Patel adjusted his tie for the third time in 2 minutes. The air conditioning hummed overhead, but sweat still beaded on Patel's forehead despite the cool temperature. Van Hollen walked in carrying a manila folder that would change everything. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors as reporters whispered among themselves. Something was different about today's hearing. The usual pre-hearing chatter felt muted, electric. CNN's camera operator noticed it first, the way Van Hollen moved with purpose, like a prosecutor approaching the bench with smoking gun evidence. Behind closed doors 20 minutes earlier, Van Hollen's chief of staff had tried one last time to talk him out of it. "Senator, once you open this door, there's no closing it. The intelligence community will never forgive this breach." Van Hollen had simply nodded and walked toward the chamber. Some doors, he knew, were meant to be opened. "Before we begin," Van Hollen announced, his voice cutting through the murmur, "I want to address some documents that came to my attention at 11:43. That was a lie. The documents had been in his possession for weeks, but Van Hollen understood theater. Timing matters in politics almost as much as Patel's knuckles went white around his water glass. Director Wray's face drained of color. In the gallery, lobbyists who usually scrolled through phones suddenly looked up. Something in Van Hollen's tone suggested this wouldn't be another routine confirmation hearing. Van Hollen opened the folder slowly, deliberately. Inside were photocopied pages with FBI letterheads, financial transfer records, and something else, surveillance photos, that made the gallery gasp audibly. The photos showed meetings, handshakes, exchanges of envelopes, people in expensive suits entering buildings that weren't supposed to exist on any official record. "Mr. Patel," Van Hollen's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Were you aware that between 2019 and 2021, the FBI allocated $47.3 million to what internal memos called Operation Blackstone?" The chamber froze. Even the C-SPAN cameras seemed to zoom in closer. Committee clerk Jennifer Martinez, who had worked these hearings for 15 years, had never heard silence like this. It felt dangerous. "Patel, Senator, I'd need to review." Van Hollen, interrupting, "These are your signatures on the authorization forms." He held up a document, turning it toward the cameras. Patel's signature was clearly visible, along with dates and dollar amounts that made reporters in the back row gasp. Silence. 4 seconds. Cameras capturing every facial expression. "Patel, I signed many documents during my previous tenure." Van Hollen, "Documents authorizing surveillance on Jeffrey Epstein's associates after his death." The last 2 words hit like lightning. Director Wray shifted uncomfortably, his hands trembling as he reached for his briefing folder. But Van Hollen wasn't done building the suspense. "Let me be more specific, Mr. Patel. Your operation didn't just monitor Epstein's known associates. According to these internal FBI emails," Van Hollen lifted another set of papers, Operation Blackstone expanded its scope to include what one memo called collateral targets of investigative interest. Patel, clearing throat, Senator, without proper security clearance review, Van Hollen, or Supreme Court Justice's collateral targets, Mr. Patel? The question landed like a bomb. Even seasoned committee members looked stunned. Senator Lindsey Graham, usually quick with responses, sat frozen. This was territory none of them had expected to enter. What happened next would be replayed on social media for weeks. Van Hollen pulled out a second set of documents, bank transfer records, showing money moving from FBI black budget accounts to offshore entities. The paper trail was damning. Millions of dollars flowing to companies that existed only on paper, companies with addresses that led to empty offices and answering services. Director Wray, Van Hollen turned to face him directly, his voice now carrying an edge that cut through the chamber's tension. Did you know that Mr. Patel's operation continued monitoring Epstein's former clients even after the case was officially closed? Wray, voice breaking, barely above a whisper. Senator, there are titles for classified. Van Hollen, classified or covered up? The room erupted. Reporters frantically typed on phones, their keyboards clicking like machine guns. Congressional staffers whispered urgently into earpieces. In the C-SPAN control room, producers scrambled to handle what was becoming the most explosive congressional testimony in decades. Van Hollen wasn't finished. He reached into the folder one more time and pulled out the final piece of evidence, a small USB drive that looked innocuous but contained enough information to topple governments. This contains 847 hours of surveillance footage, names, dates, locations, bank transfers totaling over $200 million, phone calls recorded without warrants, all collected without proper authorization, all funded by American taxpayers, all hidden from congressional oversight for over 3 years. He paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle over the room like a suffocating blanket. And all of it, every single byte of data, points to a surveillance network that goes far beyond anything Congress ever authorized or the American people ever consented to. At exactly 2:54 p.m., 67 seconds after Van Hollen's opening statement, Director Wray did something unprecedented in the modern history of congressional testimony. His composure, built over decades in law enforcement, completely shattered like glass hitting concrete. Wray, standing abruptly, his chair rolling backward. This hearing is, sits back down heavily, his hands shaking visibly. His voice cracked like a teenager. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the air conditioning. The man who had testified before Congress dozens of times, who had faced down terrorists and organized crime bosses, looked like he'd seen a ghost. His breathing became shallow, audible over the chamber's sound system. Van Hollen, leaning forward. Director, the files show surveillance on sitting senators, on Supreme Court justices, on federal judges, on... The last word hung in the air like a death sentence. Several committee members audibly gasped. Even the most hardened political observers had never seen anything like this. Wray, barely audible, his voice barely registering on the microphones. That's impossible. But his face said otherwise. The color had completely drained from his cheeks. His eyes darted between the coconuts in Van Hollen's hands, and the cameras broadcasting live to millions of Americans. Van Hollen, your own bureau was watching you, Director, recording your phone calls, monitoring your meetings, tracking your family's movements. The question is, who gave that order? Every camera in the room turned to Patel. His face had gone ashen, the confident demeanor he'd maintained throughout weeks of confirmation hearings, evaporating like morning mist. His legal training kicked in. Stay silent. Don't admit anything. But the damage was already visible to everyone watching. Within minutes, Epstein Files was trending worldwide. Twitter exploded with theories, accusations, and calls for immediate arrests. Fox News cut from their regular programming with breaking news alerts. CNN's breaking news banner flashed across millions of screens. FBI director breaks down during Epstein files revelation. In newsrooms across the country, editors scrambled to understand what they were watching. This wasn't standard political theater. This was a real-time implosion of one of America's most powerful institutions. NBC's Washington bureau chief called it Watergate in real time. At the Washington Post, reporters who'd covered intelligence scandals for decades admitted they'd never seen anything this explosive unfold live on television. Even veteran C-SPAN operators used to dry procedural hearings found themselves glued to monitors as history unfolded before their cameras. The hearing room fell into chaos. Committee members shouted over each other, demanding explanations, calling for immediate recesses, threatening subpoenas. Security guards moved closer to the witness table as Wray continued to visibly struggle, his hands now shaking so badly he couldn't hold his water glass. Van Hollen raised his voice above the noise. The American people deserve to know why $47 million of their tax dollars went to spying on their elected officials instead of protecting them from actual threats. Senator Ted Cruz, rarely speechless, leaned into his microphone. This is beyond anything we've seen. If these allegations are true, but Cruz couldn't finish the sentence. None of them could. The implications were too vast. Too dangerous. Senator Amy Klobuchar sat frozen, her usual quick responses replaced by stunned silence. Even Lindsey Graham, a master of theatrical outrage, appeared genuinely shaken. Committee stenographer Maria Santos, who'd recorded thousands of hours of testimony, later said her hands were trembling so badly she could barely type. The usually stoic Senate security detail exchanged worried glances as they watched America's intelligence apparatus implode in real time. What followed was unprecedented in modern congressional history. Director Wray, his career spanning 3 decades of distinguished service, requested a 5-minute recess. His voice barely functioned as he made the request. I need a moment to consult with counsel. But instead of composing himself during the break, he never returned to the committee room. Security footage would later show Wray stumbling down a hallway, supported by 2 FBI agents, his face pale and his breathing labored. His deputy later announced Wray had been called away on urgent FBI business. The truth leaked an hour later through back channels that every reporter in Washington knew. He'd suffered what medical staff called acute stress response and was under observation at George Washington University Hospital. Patel, left alone at the witness table like a defendant without counsel, faced 3 more hours of questioning. But the damage was irreversible. By evening, calls for his nomination withdrawal echoed from both parties. Even Trump loyalists began distancing themselves. Van Hollen's final words before adjourning became the most quoted political moment of the year. When the Bureau watches the watchers, who's protecting democracy? What Van Hollen revealed that day went beyond partisan politics or confirmation hearings. The files contained evidence of a surveillance network that operated in shadows, funded by black budgets, answerable to no oversight. Epstein's death hadn't ended the monitoring. It had expanded it into something that resembled the darkest conspiracy theories come to life. The $47 million was just the beginning. Financial analysts would later discover the true cost exceeded $200 million across multiple agencies, money that disappeared into shell companies, private contractors, and offshore accounts that led nowhere and everywhere at once. But the human cost was higher. Director Wray's breakdown represented more than personal failure or political embarrassment. It symbolized the collapse of trust between America's premier law enforcement agency and the people it swore to serve. As news networks analyzed the footage frame by frame, one question dominated every discussion. How did a freshman senator obtain classified FBI surveillance files that the director himself seemed unaware of? Van Hollen never revealed his source. In interviews weeks later, he only said, "Sometimes the truth finds a way to surface. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to hold it up to the light." But sources close to the investigation suggested the leak came from inside the FBI itself. Agents who'd grown uncomfortable with operations they couldn't understand, funding they couldn't trace, orders they couldn't question. The Epstein files remain partially classified. The FBI's internal investigation continues, though Wray's replacement has promised complete transparency while revealing nothing of substance. And somewhere in America's vast intelligence apparatus, someone is still watching. But now, thanks to 67 seconds that changed everything, we're watching back. Sometimes the strongest weapon isn't a badge or subpoena. It's truth, archived and revealed at exactly the right moment. And sometimes, when those in power least expect it, democracy finds a way to protect itself. What would you do if you had evidence this explosive? The next revelation might be closer than you think.